Craving your next action-packed adventure? Audible delivers thrills of every kind on your command, like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, where a lone astronaut must save humanity from extinction, narrated with stunning intensity by Ray Porter. From electrifying suspense and daring quest to spine-tingling horror and romance in far-off realms, unleash your adventurous side with gripping titles that'll keep you guessing. Discover exclusive Audible originals, hotly anticipated new releases, and must-listen bestsellers that hook you from the first minute. Because Audible knows there's no greater thrill than the one that speaks to you. Discover what lies beyond the edge of your seat. Start your free 30-day trial at audible.com/WonderyUS. That's audible.com/WonderyUS.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 32 of the True Crime All the Time Unsolved podcast. I'm Mike Ferguson, and with me, as always, is my partner in true crime, Mike Gibson. Gibby, what's going on?
Hey, man, it's all good.
Hey, man.
Chilling like a villain.
Oh, that's a good one. Let's hit the 1990s Wayback Machine.
That's right.
I don't even know if that was 90s. I don't know when that was. So let's do our Patreon shout outs. We have Magda Anna. The Minds of Madness, Gibbs, supported us. And for those of you that haven't listened to The Minds of Madness, it's a great podcast, true crime podcast. Tyler Allen, Beck, our friend Jordan does some social media for them.
Good group.
If you haven't checked it out, check them out. They are very, very good, and we appreciate them supporting us. Don O'Connor, Marcella Fletcher jumped out at our highest level. Gabrielle Abe, which I really hope I got that right, Gibbs.
Should have had me do it.
I should have. Shane Sankey, Mary Avery, Mandy, just Mandy.
Old Mandy.
Barry Manilow.
That's
I
right.
don't think she's old. I don't know if
old.
Oh, like O-L-E.
Like good old Mandy. Oh, Mandy.
You just said the D again.
I know. Let's go with Oh, Mandy.
Oh, yeah, I think that's what it is.
That's the song. Oh, Mandy.
I don't think it's old Mandy. Oh, Mandy, we're not making fun of you. We're making fun of ourselves. We appreciate you supporting us. And then Gibbs, going back into the vault. And look at there. We actually got a clip now of the vault.
He's so happy, by the way, folks.
I know. Well, that goes out. Special thanks to Katie. She sent us that on Twitter because she knows we're too lazy to go find the vault sound ourselves.
We do get lazy some days.
So she just said, hey, guys, here it is. So we took it and ran with it. Got to give a special shout out to Stacy Angel. And Stacy has been with us from very early on, Gibbs. She's one of our highest supporters, just has been unbelievable for us. So big time shout out to Stacy.
Thank you, Stacy, and everybody else.
Yeah, and everybody. And we actually got some donations through PayPal that I want to mention. Heath Wise and Pia Johansson.
Thanks, Heath and Pia.
Yeah, so a lot of people forget, if you want to, that's another way you can help support the show is through PayPal. If you want to support the show through Patreon, that's easy. Just go to patreon.com/truecrimeallthetime. Make sure you visit our website, truecrimeallthetime.com. We're in the process of putting all the episodes back in. We're redoing them, so it's taking me a little bit of time. And we're also going to have some new merchandise coming out with the new logo. So shirts, mugs, some cool stuff should be out in the next few weeks.
Maybe some hashtag Team Gibby stuff too.
Maybe if Gibby wants to open his wallet and buy some hashtag.
Can you
Team
play the
Gibby
vault
stuff.
noise again?
That's what it sounds like, you opening up your wallet. Hey folks, if you haven't checked out the 2 new podcasts, check out Criminology that I'm doing with Mike Morford. Season 1 is all about the Zodiac. And then also check out Sex, Love, and Murder. That's a brand new podcast. There's only there's 2 episodes out right now, And that's one that I'm doing with Aphrodite Jones. So check both of those out.
Good buzz on both of them right
Yeah.
now.
No, they're doing really good. The feedback's been great. I appreciate all the True Crime All the Time listeners that have given it a chance. That means a lot. So on True Crime All the Time, check out the second part and last part of the Menendez brothers out right now. Gibbs, we get into the trial, all the shocking revelations that come out of that. It's going to be a good one. And then I know we've talked about it for a while, but we're close to coming out with the Q&A. It won't be this week. It'll be the week after Labor Day week. And we got some voicemails that will play at the end. All right, Gibbs, so let's get into this week's case. We're talking about the Pinyon Pines murders. Heartbreaking, but very intriguing at the same time. You know, as we dive into this thing, we're going to talk about how the police handled this investigation. I mean, there's allegations of police misconduct. We've got suspects. We got arrests. We have rearrests. We got it all in this case. So on the evening of September 17th, 2006, police find the bodies of 53-year-old Vicky Friedley and her 55-year-old boyfriend, John Hayward. Now, it's going to be later determined that both Vicky and John had been shot. Now, on top of this, even more shocking, Gibbs, is the fact that in the backyard, in a burning wheelbarrow, is the charred remains of Vicky's 18-year-old daughter, Becky Friedley. And Becky's body was so badly burned that coroners are not going to be able to determine her exact cause of death. Now, Gibbs, we have to talk about how these three individuals are found in the first place, because I think it's important. You know, firefighters are responding to a call about a burning house. And as they get on scene, they find Vicky and John inside this burning house. And then they discover Becky Friedley in the backyard in this wheelbarrow that is on fire. And you can see pictures of this, Gibbs. There was actually a billboard that was put up, and I have a picture of it on our Facebook page, on our Unsolved Facebook page.
Yeah, they did a simulation of what it looked like to generate
publicity or
leads and tips and just public outcry.
So I shouldn't say picture. It's not a real picture, but it gives you a sense of how horrific this scene must have been for firefighters and then ultimately law enforcement to come upon. Becky's older sister, Tanya, now she was a deputy sheriff at the time of this murder in a neighboring town that had to make the extremely tough call to her other sister, Drew. And Drew at this point in time was stationed in Japan with the Air Force as a medic.
Tough call, man. I can't even imagine.
I can't imagine either. Very heartbreaking. You got to get up the courage to even dial the numbers.
Yeah, even with her training as a sheriff, a deputy. I can imagine. And even being on the back end, Drew being in medic. Still, how do you handle that information overseas?
I look at it two ways, Gibbs. So Tanya has some training that may help her out in this situation, but when it's your own family, I don't know how much it helps.
Yeah, I don't either.
To deal with that. And then the other thing that I'm looking at is, how hard is it for Drew to get this news being halfway around the world?
Yeah. I mean, she just found out she lost her little sister and her mom.
And can't do anything about it right then and there.
Nope.
Because she's in Japan.
Yeah, she can't come home right away and be with her family.
So we have to talk a little bit about the upbringing of the sisters. It was said that Becky and her sisters, Drew and Tanya, they grew up on this property and, from everything you read, had a very, very good childhood. Now, their dad, Ron Friedley, he was a retired sheriff investigator. He had actually built this house in the mountains of the Coachella Valley where they grew up. And Ron would say later that he felt this was a perfect setting for the kids. It was out in the country, had a whole bunch of hiking trails through the forest. It was said that Ron and Vicky were very good parents. Vicky's daughter, Drew, would tell reporters that her mom was a very kind-hearted, just a wonderful woman. And their other daughter, Tanya, would say that Vicky was a great mom. She loved to garden. She loved to sew. She was a great cook. So much so that she enjoyed immensely, Gibbs, teaching all the girls how to cook from a very early age. Becky's older sisters, obviously this was tragic for them, but they would come out and really paint a picture of just what type of person Becky was. They said she was a very spirited girl. She had a lot of energy. They talked about what an amazing person she was. She always had a smile on her face. She was the type of person that if you were in a bind and you needed help, Becky was the one to call. She would do anything to help you out. Becky was extremely intelligent, very congenial. She got along with everybody. Gibbs, just a fun, happy girl. I don't know how else to put it. Everybody that talked about Becky, they had nothing but glowing things to say about her.
Yeah, it sounds like she was just a really good kid, man.
Yeah, she really was. And again, any type of murder situation is tragic, but when you hear what people say about Becky, and Vicky and John for that matter, right, it just makes it that much more tragic.
And the other thing is, this is a service family. You can tell, right? The dad's retired police. The Tanya's is a deputy, and Drew's a medic. That's just some dedication, but it's got to be really tough because they're in that line of business. I almost wonder if it hits home a little bit harder because when it's in your area of expertise, I think you get really frustrated.
Well, and I think we'll see that as we go along in this story, right, Gibbs, especially from Ron and Tanya, who are in law enforcement. Now, Ron's retired.
Sure.
But he knows how it works.
Right.
And so he's definitely going to have some frustrations as we go through this thing. We talk about how idyllic the girl's childhood is, Gibbs, but, as the best of marriages sometimes do, Ron and Vicky drifted apart and they end up divorcing after 13 years of marriage. After the marriage ended, Ron moved out. Eventually, Tanya and Drew would leave the house, right? They grow up, they leave the house. Becky, being younger, she stays behind with her mom, Vicky. And years later, Vicky would meet and fall in love with a man named John Hayward. And John Hayward was a local contractor. And he had a daughter named Katie from a previous marriage. And John's daughter, Katie, would say that Vicky and her dad were very much in love. They shared a love of the outdoors. They loved being out in the country. And they just felt very safe up there. Now, Gibbs, I think pretty early on, law enforcement starts to wonder if possibly this murder could have something to do with Ron's previous stint in law enforcement, some criminal type element that wanted to take revenge against Ron. But I think it comes out that, Ron wasn't really ever really involved in anything that would have created that type of situation, right? He wasn't taking down drug kingpins or busting up mafia rings or anything like that.
Yeah, so he wasn't like a John Wick or anything.
Yeah, I think he was, a good officer.
Right.
But doing normal type things. He didn't have any high profile arrests or anything that really would tie back to somebody wanting to get revenge on him.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
But what happens, Gibbs, is after investigators kind of rule out this angle of it possibly being somebody from Ron's past, then they start focusing on him because he is the ex-husband.
Which all makes sense.
It does.
In a typical investigation, right? You would go towards the ex-husband.
Well, because the boyfriend has been murdered.
Right.
So the next logical person to look at would be the ex. But they rule him out very quickly. Now, they do ask him to take a polygraph test, and Ron agrees, and he passes. But the other thing that really kind of solidifies the fact that Ron couldn't have done this is that police are able to pull his phone records, and those are going to put him about 11 hours away at his property in Northern California at the time that the crime took place.
So you can imagine after Ron had time to get his head clear. I don't know how you get your head clear from that, right? But he had some time to start thinking, and go from the dad and the ex-husband that lost people near and dear to him. He was able to flip that hat over and start being that investigator that he retired as. So as he's thinking, he's realizing this had nothing to do with Vicky or Vicky's boyfriend, John, that this was all about Becky, that somehow Becky was targeted. He recalls that Becky had a fear of fire at a very early age, and this fear came about because she was helping her mom cook something on the stovetop, and she reached up, and somehow, as kids can do when you're cooking, if you're not careful, they grab up there, and she grabbed the skillet, and the skillet tipped, and hot grease got on her chest and gave her third-degree burns. This is pretty traumatic for a kid, anybody, but let alone a kid. So even said by Becky's best friend, this was a huge issue for her. Not only did she have the physical scar of the burn, right, but she had the mental scars that went along with it and the fear ever since then of any type of fire.
Yeah, I would think that kind of traumatic experience, that's the kind of thing that would stay with the kid for a very long time.
Yeah, and you would never want, she never wanted to feel that pain again, be burnt again, and these horrible people, whoever did this to her, put her through her worst fear.
Now, a friend of Becky's would go to the police and tell them that she knew right away after the murder who was responsible for this crime. And she would say that the person did it intentionally and she knew who it was from day one. And this friend would tell Becky's dad, Ron, as well. And the person that she would name to both Ron and the police was Robert Pape. She would later say the minute she heard about the murder, this was her first thought. So, Gibbs, we have to talk about who's Robert Pape.
Yeah, who is this guy?
Well, he was Becky's ex-boyfriend. They had dated through high school. I think it was said they dated for approximately 15 months. And, in the world of high school dating, high school love, that's a pretty long time, actually.
It really is.
15 months. And Gibbs, for Becky especially, this relationship was a significant one because Robert Pape was her first love.
Now, it was even said that 10 months prior to this murder, that Becky and her best friend, they went on vacation together and just hanging out with some other friends, girlfriends, things like that, that I guess Robert was kind of jealous because he would call about 30 times per night. And he would call, talk to her, immediately call back. And it was kind of annoying, both to Becky, but also to people that she was around because he was constantly checking up on her.
Well, it sounds obsessive.
Somewhat, I would say.
And it also sounds to me like either he's not a trusting person by nature, or for some reason, he didn't trust Becky.
Yeah.
Or didn't trust anybody at all. One or the other.
Right.
Or both.
Or both, yeah. So we know sometime in January, they both decide to mutually break up, go their separate ways, and start dating other people. So even after the breakup, Becky's friend would say that Robert was still being really obsessive and starting to get somewhat strange and weird about the whole thing. And this was just months before the murder. And then 3 weeks before her death, she was with another best friend of hers. And she told her best friend that Robert had threatened to kill her because he didn't want anybody else to have her. If he couldn't have her, nobody could have her. And we hear this sometimes in some cases, and people get that jealous.
And I think that gets very scary, Gibbs. When you hear somebody say something like that, if I can't have you, nobody's going to have you, that is a very bad sign, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Someone tells you that, get away now.
Get some protection, do something.
Yeah, that's not healthy at all.
No, because that is not, I don't want to use the word normal, but that's not a phrase that someone should be using. Let's just put it that way.
Now, Becky would tell her friend that she just kind of shook it off. Didn't put much weight behind it. She was just trying to move on, and she kind of left it at that.
Well, and how normal is that, Gibbs? Let's talk about that, because this guy's saying this stuff to Becky, but this is a person that she was in love with at one time, cared about deeply at one time. I could see how somebody would just kind of, I don't want to call it blowing it off, but not take it for the grave indicator that it really might be.
I agree with that.
When I had asked her how everything was going, she said that he would show up everywhere, and then he told her that he threatened to kill her, and she said he's so crazy he even threatened to kill me. And I said, do you find that serious? Do you think it's a serious threat? And she said no. And she just brushed it off like it wasn't a deal, and then 3 weeks later she's gone.
So that was Becky's friend talking to the media. Now, Gibbs, obviously they have distorted her voice, so she won't be recognized, I guess.
Maybe not.
Makes it a little harder to hear, a little harder to understand, but you basically hear the same thing that we were talking about, that Becky had confided in her, this thing that Robert had said, but the friend also says that, Becky didn't seem very concerned about it. In her own words, she said she kind of brushed it off. But the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, Gibbs, they've already got Robert Pape on their radar. But all this information coming in, it intensifies the way that they're looking at him, because the police had several sources giving them information about Robert. Another source was a close male friend of Becky's named Javier Garcia Jr., and Javier had given investigators some interesting facts as well. He would say that on the night of the murders, Becky was going hiking on her property with Robert and his friend Christian Smith. Becky's sister Tanya would later come out and say that her thought is that Becky wanted to smooth things over with Robert in an attempt to get to some type of friendship level. Javier's tip put Robert Pape and Christian Smith at the scene of the crime the night that these murders occurred. But the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, they never publicly shared any details of the investigation, and they wouldn't name any suspects for many years.
And the frustrating part is they kind of just pass the case from one detective to another over time.
Well, part of that is maybe that they had this very strong suspicion of these two boys, but did they have enough to make an arrest? And my assumption is no, or they would have.
Yeah, but I think it was frustrating for the families, right? Because I don't think the families, and I know that police aren't always going to tell the families everything going on, right? They like to hold back for good reasons, but I think, the families are probably like, come on.
Man, what's going on?
Yeah. Why is it taking so long?
In the course of a normal investigation, if it's not solved, particularly with a homicide, relatively soon, then the case gets handed off when somebody gets transferred, when somebody gets promoted, when somebody retires. And when you're talking about 6.5 years, this case has been given to several different investigators. Each time somebody new gets it, they have to start from scratch and read every piece of paper associated with the case, which can take weeks or months, and then figure out what their game plan's going to be. So it takes a long time. The investigators seem less than interested, and it's taken multiple, 20 and 30 phone calls, and it gives the appearance of a less than professional investigation.
So obviously that person's voice is disguised as well. I promise you that's not our equipment messing up. These are just people disguising their voices because they don't want people to know who they are when they're talking to the media.
I think you're right, Mike. It's not our equipment doing that right now.
Promise you it's not.
I promise it's not the equipment.
But this guy Gibbs, he kind of piggybacks on what you were saying. When you talked about the file being handed from one detective to another, now he jumps a little bit ahead in time, right? He actually says we're 6.5 years down the road,
right.
But it's a good place to play that clip because it backs it up. And one of the very interesting things he talks about is every time a new detective gets it, it's almost like they're starting from scratch. right? They got to figure out what their game plan is. They have to make probably calls again that another detective has already made to try to follow up on stuff. It just doesn't seem like the best way to go about it.
You know how it is. I mean, you get momentum, you want to keep on the momentum. You let off, man, it's just the efforts to get it going again. It's just takes so much energy to do that.
So I want to go back a little bit chronologically 3 years after the murder and talk about a friend of Ron Friedley's by the name of Luis Bolaños. And Luis Bolaños was a private investigator. And at this point, he actually asked his friend Ron if he could help and assist and get this case moving along. And the plan that Luis has is to get this case back in the media, because his hope is that the media coverage is going to put pressure on the police to step up their investigation. And he actually works at this, Gibbs, for many years. And on the 6-year anniversary of the crime, there's still no arrests in sight. Luis does something very provocative. He puts up a billboard, and on this billboard is a beautiful picture of Becky Friedley on one side, and on the other, it's what we talked about earlier, Gibbs. It's a simulated picture of what the burning wheelbarrow might have looked like with Becky inside it. So imagine driving down the street, Gibbs, and how eye-catching this billboard must have been, and what people must have felt when they saw it.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine, but I mean, surely they were ticked off, right? That this horrific crime has yet to be solved.
Well, and also it had to be pretty tough on the family.
I'm sure he gave them a heads up not to go that direction, but if they did by chance, I couldn't imagine what they felt looking up and seeing that.
Well, yeah, I don't think Luis would have done this being a family friend without the consultation of at least Ron. But the billboard idea actually worked because it got a lot of media attention, and over the year that it was up, tips started to come in. One of the tips that came in was from Becky's own cousin by the name of Daniela, and she remembered something that could actually help the investigation.
So what Daniela did, she told the police that she had spoken to Becky actually the night before the murder, and that Becky had told her that her ex-boyfriend Robert had come into her place of work, which was a Denny's. And if you don't know what a Denny's is, that's like a Waffle House, a pink, a breakfast restaurant kind of a place. And that he was harassing her to the point that he had to be removed from the restaurant. That's pretty significant. And it was said this is why Becky would later agree to meet both Robert and his friend Christian to go hiking by her house so they could talk this out, about the argument. And again, she just wanted to get to that friendship level. And I think, this is what she was trying to attempt. Get some resolution with this situation that she's had with Robert, going back to Denny's and some of the things that he said in the past. So knowing all this stuff, police is hearing all this type of information, but yet, no arrests have been made. It's just, again, it's got to be frustrating for friends, family, the community in general, really, that no one's been arrested.
And not only that, Gibbs, but I think it's really frustrating for Luis Bolaños as well, because he's put himself in the middle of this, trying to help his friend Ron. And I think his big takeaway is that the police aren't doing anything to move this thing along.
Luis Bolaños made some very serious accusations against the Riverside County Sheriff's Office and the District Attorney's Office.
Our investigation has revealed 7 direct links between the persons of interest, and these are major persons of interest, and the Freely family and law enforcement.
Bolaños is talking about the 7-year-old Pinyon Pines triple murder case where 18-year-old Becky Friedley, her mother, and mother's boyfriend were murdered and set on fire. He believes the case is cold, and the people he believes are responsible are still free because of those conflicts of interest and because investigators botched the case from the beginning. Now another accusation of improper investigating in the case.
They interviewed one of these persons of interest at one point, They waited over a year before they served a search warrant at this person's house. They served the search warrant, and we know for a fact at that search warrant scene, they recovered something.
So on the 7th anniversary of the murders, Luis held a press conference at the murder site. And Luis would talk about his theories on how especially Becky was murdered and set on fire.
So it looks like the suspects caught up with her maybe 100 feet from here, 150 feet, incapacitated her to a point, and brought her back in a wheelbarrow and decided they were going to ignite her, cover her in some type of flammable liquid and light her on fire.
Gibbs, to me, when you hear it laid out like that, it just sounds so gruesome.
Cruel.
You know, because I don't know that they are able to figure out whether or not she was dead before she was set on fire.
That's how badly she was burnt.
And so that you have to wonder,
Yeah.
was she burned alive? I mean, what a horrible way to go. And after you talked about, you know, the fear that she had of fire, of being burned. Now, she might have been incapacitated or out or whatever, but still, you get set on fire, you're coming too.
It's a bullshit thing to do to somebody,
I agree with you.
especially somebody loving, caring, beautiful like she was. Anybody, but you know, I don't know. It really upsets me.
But this is the point where the DEA's office finally steps in. They subpoena Robert Pape and Christian Smith to appear before a grand jury. And after the grand jury, the police would arrest Pape and Smith for the triple homicide.
26-year-old Christian Smith, formerly from the Coachella Valley, now in the Army in Washington State, and 26-year-old Robert Pape of Cathedral City. He is the ex-boyfriend of victim 18-year-old Becky Friedley. The Sheriff's Department confirms to us Pape was arrested just after 4 this afternoon in Salton City, near the intersection of Treadwell Boulevard and Desert Air.
The other suspect, Christian Smith, is a sergeant in the Army based in Washington State. He was arrested this afternoon in a parking lot at Palm Springs Airport as he was preparing to board a flight back to Washington. His flight to and from Palm Springs paid for by the Riverside County District Attorney's Office. But he didn't get a chance to get on that return flight. Instead, he was taken into custody. We understand his wife was with him when he was arrested, but she is not involved in the case.
And adding on to this, Gibbs, Luis Bolaños had a tape from an interview that he did with Pape about 3 months before he was arrested, where he told Pape he was making a tribute video for Becky. And during this video is the following exchange.
So Luis would ask Robert, when was the last time you saw her? And in the video, you see Robert, he kind of looks up at the sky and he says, shoot, I guess that was some time ago. And then Luis would ask again, I mean, the last time you saw her, that would be pretty special. Okay, so how about the last couple times, your last memories, the last time you spoke on the phone? And Robert would pause and he would say, you know, I can't think off the top of my head.
Now, Gibbs, that seems strange to me for someone who was involved with Becky and was making contact with her prior to her death.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just strange that he couldn't recall little things like that.
Well, and you say little things, and I get what you're saying, but the minute that you find out that someone that you loved had been murdered, I don't know, Gibbs, in my mind, I think, wouldn't you remember the last time you talked to him?
Yeah.
It seems like that would... Now, we are talking 7 years down the road, and 7 years is a long time. People forget things, but that might be one of those things that would stick in your head. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I would think so. I think at this point, the families of, you know, Becky and Vicky and John are starting to see some action. Things are moving forward. And to the point that I even think the DA's office really feels like they've got the right suspects in custody now, and that hopefully things can progress in the right direction.
But the same can't be said for the families of Robert Pape and Christian Smith. As you would think, Gibbs, they don't think these boys had anything to do with these murders. So Robert Pape and Christian Smith are in the Riverside County Courthouse charged with triple homicide, and they both plead not guilty. But we have to talk a little bit about Christian Smith and Robert Pape because, this is 7 years later. At the time of the murders, these kids were, one of them was 17 years old, Gibbs?
Yeah, 17 and 18.
And the other was 18. Now they're 25, 26.
Well, none of them have criminal records. And Christian Smith, he's married now, and he's a decorated war hero. And even Robert Pape is married at this time to the girl that he started dating right after Becky. He married Sarah.
Well, you mentioned they didn't have criminal records. That's a big deal a lot of times in cases, right? Because if you have a long rap sheet, that goes against you. If you have no type of criminal record, that usually goes in your favor.
But if you do like I did and get your criminal record expunged, once his ankle.
You got it what?
Expunged.
Expunged?
Expunged.
Or expunged?
Expunged.
Okay.
Yeah.
Either one
works
for you.
Expunge works better than esponge.
Yeah, I think it does.
The sponge
one of them costs a little less,
Yeah.
but it doesn't
Cleans
do the
up
same
good.
thing.
Cleans up good.
We talked a little bit about the families of the accused. Now, they would talk to the media as well, Gibbs, talking about how hard it was to see, their loved ones charged for these horrific crimes that they didn't believe they had anything to do with. And they would go on to say that, these young men were not the monsters that the media had been making them out to be.
Yeah, and even the mom and sister or a friend of the family to Robert would say that in America, you're innocent until proven guilty, but they really felt like, no, you're guilty and you have to prove your innocence. Because they locked these guys up. They were arrested. They were locked up while this investigation was going on. And in the eyes of the public, they were, the media, like you said, the media portrayed them as these monsters.
Well, yeah, because let's go back to how horrific these murders were.
Terrible.
And so they'd been looking for the killer or killers for 7 years now. It had gotten a lot of media exposure. And so imagine the media explosion once they tie these two guys and actually charge them.
Sure, especially seeing the billboard and the video that Luis put out there at the, he was at the house describing how the murder of Becky took place. I'm sure that stuck in people's heads.
So Robert's family comes out talking about, what an amazing person he has, what kind of gentle person. He has a great heart. He's honest. He's hardworking. And they make a point of saying, Gibbs, that he had always taken care of the women in his life.
Which is an interesting statement.
It is. But I think they're, that's an angle, right? They're trying to put out there that, this guy would not hurt a woman. And you mentioned that Robert married a woman named Sarah, and this was a girl that he started dating right after Becky. And as the hearings take place, Robert has a lot of character witnesses, and there were people in the courtroom, Gibbs, that said that the number was as high as 30 that would come up and talk about how good his character was and were there to support him. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of character witnesses. Now, you talk about Christian Smith's family, his dad comes out pretty quickly saying, I know my son could not have done this. He's just not capable of this type of thing. You mentioned Smith being a war hero, and a lot of people would play on this in talking about what an honorable man he was, what an amazing job he had done serving his country. He was part of the Army's elite 75th Ranger Regiment, and he had been in Afghanistan.
So Smith had won commendations for valor. He also was awarded 2 Purple Hearts, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's huge. To win 1 Purple Heart means an incredible sacrifice for your country. To get 2 Purple Hearts, Gibbs, that really saying something.
So no doubt, this young man, he did some incredible things, in serving his country.
Yeah, that's not something that you can overlook. You can't take that away from him, that he accomplished those things. But you have to go back to when he was 17 years old, because that's what he's being charged with. as a 17-year-old committing murder with his 18-year-old best friend, Robert Pape. And we really haven't talked much about the relationship of Pape and Smith, Gibbs, but it was said that they were best friends growing up. But it was also said that when they got together, they would oftentimes cause trouble. And another thing that would come out is that they had some type of big fascination with fire. So that doesn't make them look good, knowing what happened to Becky. And Gibbs, I think this leads us into talking about some of the evidence that's going to be used against Smith and Pape.
So the police knew that Becky had complained about Robert and Christian to a close friend at one time, that there was a time that they were playing with fire, and that Robert and Christian, they ignited a king-size mattress, and they really got a kick out of this. So this really upset Becky, and we know why. I mean, her dad talked about it, how she had this huge fear of fire and being burnt. So I'm sure she was just terrified. Now, just months before the murders, Robert had messaged his new girlfriend, which was Sarah, which is now his wife, that he could help Sarah out with her ex-boyfriend issues. And he tells her in this message, instant message, if you know where he lives, we can professionally burn his house down. Now, this statement was made just months before the murder of Becky, Becky's mom, and John.
So, Gibbs, in the earlier grand jury trial, both men pleaded the fifth. But when they were questioned by police prior to the grand jury, both men said they never went near Becky's home. They never went hiking with her that day. And the alibi that they used was that they were both headed to church that night. And on the way, they happened to call the church, but the church was closed. So they turned around and they went back to Smith's house for the night and played video games. So Gibbs, I'm trying to break this down, and I'm not able to make a lot of sense out of it. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. It just seems very strange to me. You're on your way to church, and you just happen to call the church because, why, you not sure if they're open or closed?
Yeah, I think if you're headed to church, you know their schedule because you go frequently, and if it's not the case, you would call before you left.
Well, churches have a pretty set schedule.
Typically, they do.
So, I don't know.
I mean,
I don't want to harp on it a lot, but it does seem a little odd.
It is a little strange. I mean, I understand pleading. The other statement had an issue with was the fact that they pleaded the fifth, but I understand on an attorney's advice, you can't read too much into that because that's the attorneys telling them to do that.
Yeah.
For future protection.
You're right. I never make too much out of that because, if your attorney is advising you that it's in your best interest to plead the fifth, then you plead the fifth.
Yeah. Doesn't mean you're guilty. It's just a protection device.
But getting back to this alibi that they had for the night of the murders, so they go back to Smith's house to play video games, but nobody else is at Christian's house. So there's no one to confirm this.
Well, they're their own alibis, right?
And that's a problem.
That is a problem.
And later on that night, they would say that they went to a middle school to play paintball. But again, this is the type of alibi or the type of activity where there was nobody around. There was nobody else to confirm that they did this. It was just the two of them saying, here's what we did this night. There's nobody else that can confirm it.
So a 17-year-old, 18-year-old decides to go play paintball at a middle school, and nobody can recall it. There's no account for it. I can see the problem with that.
No, it is a problem. Now, I'm assuming based on the fact that there's nobody else to confirm this, Gibbs, that it's just the two of them shooting each other with paintballs. Or maybe you hide behind a tree and I'll hide over here.
I mean, if it was me and you playing, I think you would probably just ask me to stand there for a minute and just shoot paintballs at me.
Well, I would.
Until you ran out.
I always thought paintball was more of a you needed more people. I guess you don't. You can just play one-on-one, but
I'd probably kick your ass, actually.
Nah, dude, I would smoke you.
Challenge accepted.
So we have problems with their alibis, but an even bigger issue is their cell phones, because their cell phones place them somewhere else completely. Robert's phone pinged near the road that led to Becky's house around 7:13 p.m. And then Gibbs, I think this is the big one because both of their cell phones were shut off at one point that night, and they would not ping anything again until after 10 p.m.
And that's interesting because we know that the murders occurred somewhere around like 9:42, 9:45. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as far as evidence goes, that's not looking good for Robert Pape and Christian Smith. And then you talk about some of the evidence that police found at the murder scene. So police find footprints at the murder scene near this desert type area that existed behind the Friedley house. And the ground showed wheelbarrow tracks from the desert area behind the house. And police would say that based on the tracks, and Gibbs, I'm sure they use some kind of compression testing, like you would do with a footprint to get a gauge of how heavy a person is or, how much somebody weighs. But based on testing, the police theorized that Becky must have been in the wheelbarrow when those tracks were made. And the tracks stopped up by the house, and this was where Becky was set on fire in the wheelbarrow. So it sounds like a lot of good evidence. The other thing that police find is a business card by the wheelbarrow, and they test this business card for DNA. And what do you know, Gibbs? They find Christian Smith's DNA on this card.
Pretty compelling.
So far it is.
Yeah.
The police would later come out and state that Vicky Friedley was shot with a .40 caliber handgun and John Hayward was shot with a shotgun prior to the house being set on fire.
Pape allegedly told investigators he and Christian were alone the entire night. But cell phone activity places Robert and Christian in the proximity of the Friedley home before and after the crimes. At the scene of the crime, near where Becky's body was found, was a business card that had Christian Smith's DNA. The chance that such a DNA match could happen at random is 1 in 320,000. Their phones were both turned off from 7 p.m. till 11 p.m. A, quote, unprecedented anomaly in their cellular activity records. A year later, on October 2nd, 2007, a search of Pape's house found a 12-gauge shotgun and a holster for a Glock handgun. A search of Smith's house found 2 12-gauge shotguns.
So I think you hear from the reporter, Gibbs, some of the same things that we already talked about, but what's very interesting is the search of the two boys' homes, right? So at Christian Smith's house, they find 2 shotguns, and at Robert Pape's house, they find a shotgun. They don't find a handgun, but they find accessories and a holster for a Glock. And we haven't talked about it, but it's believed that it was a Glock that was used as part of the murder.
Right.
Now, the other thing that you hear is that this search of each one of their homes was done a year later. And I think you heard Bolaños talk about that.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating, to do a search a year after the fact.
And it's going to come up at trial, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about it now. But at trial, it's going to be brought up what obstacles this type of delay in actually conducting the search presents. So, Gibbs, we've talked about some of the evidence that police and prosecutors have. Let's now talk about what the defense does to challenge this evidence. And the first thing that they do is they challenge this story that you talked about of the fight that occurred between Robert and Becky at the Denny's where she worked. And then they go on to try to soften the instant message exchange between Robert and his girlfriend at the time, Sarah, who's now his wife, where you talked about him saying that they could burn down her ex-boyfriend's house. So the defense is really going after this as, this was just a couple of kids joking. It was taken out of context. And Robert's defense attorney harps on the fact that, Robert never threatened Becky with her life. Robert moved on with his life. And they tried to paint it as more of Becky who was trying to revive the relationship. So Gibbs, you have to think, if you're Becky's family sitting in a courtroom, hearing a defense attorney basically trying to turn this around on your daughter, your sister, who was murdered and burned in a wheelbarrow, I don't know how I would keep from going ballistic.
Yeah, I'd be pissed.
But now, let's be frank, that is a defense attorney's job.
Sure.
But it had to have been hard to hear.
And in fairness of the defense, what if it's true?
So now we talk about Christian Smith's defense attorney, and he really points to the fact of why was Christian Smith even arrested at all? Because unlike Robert Pape, Christian Smith had no previous relationship with Becky Friedley. He had no incidents where he allegedly threatened her or fought with her or anything like that. Smith's defense attorney tried to attack the cell phone tower evidence by saying, it didn't mean anything. It was just an anomaly that the boys' phones were off for what was a pretty long period of time, Gibbs, 3 or 4 hours, somewhere in that ballpark. But it doesn't prove anything besides the fact that they didn't want to take any calls. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I buy that, because what kid do you know of that turns their cell phone off for 3 or 4 hours? Now, this was 2006, but there was messaging. It wasn't the same as it is today, but there was still a lot of ways to contact through the phone.
Absolutely. I mean, the kids today might not answer their phone when you want them to, but their phones are on, right? Because they're messaging, they're Facebooking, their friends or whatever. Now, back then, like you said, they could message, text, call, and I'm sure they were doing that with their friends. They just might not answer calls from people they didn't want to talk to, like parents.
And Smith's attorney had to challenge that business card that was found at the scene that had his client's DNA on it. And he did this by saying it was very possible that Becky could have gotten this card from Smith in the past and just dropped it on the property there herself.
So what a stretch of the imagination for me to say something like that. Because if you're going to say that he didn't really have a relationship with her or knew her that well, but yet somehow she was able to get a business card on her person that had his DNA on it, that somehow fell off of her while she was in the wheelbarrow. I don't know. I just think it's a weird, I know what he's doing. He's trying to discredit anything that's been said.
I don't think he's saying that it fell off of her in the wheelbarrow.
Well, how does it get by the wheelbarrow in the backyard?
No, I think he's just saying it could have been out in the yard days before or whenever.
Yeah, I just think it's a really long shot.
Well, but again, like we talked about, that's a defense attorney's job.
Yeah.
Long shot or not, what can I throw out there that would provide even a hint of reasonable doubt?
Yeah, well, that's true. That's his job, provide doubt.
But I agree with you. It's you're shooting in the dark. You're throwing whatever you can out there to see if anything, it just has to stick with one juror. And then we get to the gun evidence, Gibbs. And, to me, there's a lot of interesting components here, because the defense is going to make the argument that, okay, you found some guns, but what does that prove? Because the fact is, the guns that they found, they were very popular guns. They were guns that a lot of people had, right? These brands. But the interesting part to me is that no ballistics were ever done. So that's where you get to the point of saying, okay, having the same make, model of a gun that they think might have been the murder weapon, that doesn't make you guilty. Now, if you can tie that gun ballistically to the gun that was used to commit the murder, that's a whole different story. But they can't do that. And to top it all off, Christian Smith's dad would come out and say that on the day of the murder, he had those guns with him in the trunk of his car, and he was in another state altogether.
So now this is when the defense attorneys are going to start pointing a finger at another suspect, and it's going to raise some questions. And they're going to talk about Becky's good friend, Javier Garcia Jr. And this is the friend of Becky's that told the police about, well, basically he had the knowledge that Robert and Christian were going to meet up with Becky and take a hike behind the house on the trails, and they were going to talk about the relationship like we said. Javier was going to meet up with them up there, and Javier, when he was going to meet up with them, called ahead when he was nearby. And at that point, Becky said, don't bother, don't come up here. I just need to talk to him. And Javier, at that point, decided to turn around and head back down the mountain to town. And this is all confirmed with his cell records. So they show his movement, right? They can show that he went up towards Becky's house, but at the time of the murders, he was far away back in town.
But the defense, Gibbs, they're going to argue that everything that Javier is saying is hearsay, and they go on to say that Javier had a crush on Becky, and his cell phone records show his phone pinging by Becky's house that day, and they question why the prosecutors gave him immunity.
So the reason he gets immunity, one, he's the state's witness, but he's not just a regular kid. His dad happens to be an investigator for the DA's office, and his dad has a lot of power, a lot of connections. His dad says, look, we're going to cooperate. We're going to give this evidence that you have to the state, but you're my boy. I'm going to protect you. Here's this attorney friend of ours that's going to make sure that it's done the correct way. This attorney actually makes a statement to a news broadcast that he purposely got him immunity to protect him, and he comes across kind of braggadocious that he says, I'm just a really good attorney. I'm that good. And that's why I got him immunity for making a simple statement like he did. So I think this helps us understand Javier's connection. So the other connection that Javier has in this case, besides being a really good friend to Becky, and of course being a key witness, there was also a small little fact that came about. And the best way to bring it to your attention is just to play this clip.
7 years later, after nothing had been done in this case, I attended the press conference at the site of the homicide. And during that time, I had spoken with Investigator Bolaños and some of his fellow workers and told them after the crime scene had originally been cleared and the family was allowed to respond up to the house that we recovered Becky's car. And inside that car, there was a ring. Maybe not real important, but it was a gold ring, and on that ring was written Javier on the outside in black letters. Inside the ring was inscribed, Bonnie loves you. And after talking to Bolaños and other investigators, they felt that this might have some type of evidentiary value in the case.
So that was Becky's dad, Ron, talking about this ring that he found in Becky's car sometime after the murders, after the crime scene had been released. And you brought it up, Gibbs. It's another interesting connection with Javier, but what does it really mean? You know, that ring could have found its way in her car for any number of reasons.
Sure, especially since they were known to be really good friends.
Yeah, but we wanted to talk about it because I do think it's interesting. So we're 8 years after the murder, Gibbs. We're in the trial, and there's a big twist that comes in this trial. Because the prosecutor walks into the courthouse one day and drops the case against Pape and Smith with what amounts to just very little explanation for the decision. You know, they have a prepared statement which basically says that there were some legal issues which arose during the grand jury proceedings against Robert Pape that made it necessary to ultimately dismiss the charges against both men.
So, and I don't know if this goes back to Javier, but it was said that the attorney general actually had to look into him being given immunity because the connection that his dad clearly had with the DA's office, that could have that been some wrongdoing. And the attorney general at the time said he was okay with it at that time, but he would have to have some further review, and left it at that. So maybe it had some further review and they decided, you know, we can't be using this guy as a witness against these two kids.
Because of the connection.
Because of the connection. So I don't know if that's what it was because it's never disclosed, but it would make sense to me if that was part of the reason.
And maybe that's where you get into, some people talking about, I don't want to call it police corruption, but maybe, and I don't even know if misconduct is the right word either, but there are a lot of people in this case that point to, let's call it the police and prosecutors kind of botching this thing up for a period of time.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people thought they were handed, not the smoking gun, but handed a pretty good case, and they couldn't get it to the table.
Well, you and I went through the evidence, and there was some pretty compelling evidence against these two men.
Sure.
But now they're set free. Now, I'm sure their families were ecstatic over them being out.
Oh, they were, yeah, they loved it, man. I mean, they couldn't wait to see these kids, and I believe that Christian's wife just had a baby not too long ago, and he couldn't wait to get his hands on his little kid, because he hadn't had a chance to do that being in jail.
So, Gibbs, we have to talk about some information that comes out after the trial. And what we ultimately find out is that in 2012, during the initial investigation, and this was before the trial, right? This is 2012. The police wiretapped both Pape and Smith, and they recorded over 900 calls in 2012. But these wiretaps remained sealed for a number of years and were not disclosed in court until 2016. So they recorded 581 calls by Pape, approximately 330 calls by Smith, and we're not sure what kind of information they have, Gibbs, but I imagine there's possibly some incriminating stuff in there. And additionally, what you have is court documents that reveal kind of a rather bizarre claim against Christian Smith, because it comes out that he had made some type of incriminating statement after an interview with police when he didn't realize that he was still being recorded. And Gibbs, I don't know if you've seen The Jinx, but this is basically what happens on The Jinx.
I haven't, but...
No, you should. It's very good.
Okay.
What happens is Robert Durst is being filmed by these documentary filmmakers, and they leave the room. And he's unaware, I think, that he's still being recorded. And he says something that kind of ignites, his whole prosecution. I can't remember. It was something along the lines of, well, they've got you now, or, he's talking to himself. And this is basically what the police say happened. They were interviewing Smith in May of 2012. He wasn't answering any questions, but then they left him alone in the interview room. He was still being recorded, and police say that this is the point where he uttered what they called some potentially incriminating words that were caught on tape. But this is not the end of this case, Gibbs, because in June of 2016, Pape and Smith were charged again with 3 counts of murder, and this time a special circumstance of committing multiple murders was added for the 2006 murders of Becky, Vicky, and John. And the special circumstance, I think, Gibbs, is because their bodies were burned after they were killed. Now, it was said that there was some new technology and some new evidence uncovered that led to the rearrest. They had a preliminary hearing that lasted almost 4 days in October of 2016. And at this hearing, the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence for Pape and Smith to stand trial. Now, the interesting thing is at this hearing, Gibbs, the DA's office only had to present just a portion of their evidence. So they didn't have to show all their cards at this preliminary hearing. So at this time in 2006, the special circumstance charge made Robert Pape eligible for the death penalty. Now, Christian Smith was not eligible because he was a minor at the time the murders occurred. But DA Mike Hestron later makes a decision that he's not going to seek the death penalty against Pape. Now, there was a new key witness, Gibbs, that came forward. And according to court documents, this witness says that Christian Smith told him back in 2007 that he was responsible for the fire at the Friedley home. And the quote that I saw that was allegedly made by Christian Smith was, "Something went wrong and we torched the whole effing place."
Pretty compelling.
Yeah, if that's a true statement, that is very, very compelling.
Yeah.
But Gibbs, how different of a case is this for you and I on Unsolved?
Right.
Very different.
Unsolved, solved, unsolved, might be headed to
Might
being
be solved. Because, well, the other difference is this is taking place right now.
Yeah, when's the next trial?
I think it's set for 2018. There might be some type of hearing that's coming up in November.
Okay.
But you and I have never done a case like this where, a murder that took place so long ago, and there are people that are charged with it right now. The case is going on. It's getting ready to go to trial.
Well, you know what? I hope for Ron and for Tanya and for Drew and for John's daughter that they get some closure finally and they can, move on from this.
Well, and so we may have a positive outcome in this case, which will switch it to solved.
Right.
So if that's the case, Gibbs, we'll just do an update and then push it over to True Crime All the Time.
Yeah.
Because it'll be a solved case by that point.
I like that.
This might be one that we have to do an update on because there will be an update, later this year, probably more into 2018.
Yeah. So hopefully some of our California peeps will, they'll probably hear about the updates before we will. So maybe they'll shoot those over to us.
Well, they're going to post them in the True Crime All the Time group.
Right.
That's a given.
Yeah, that's true.
But anyway, a lot of twists and turns in this one. Like you said, you just want to find out what happened. You want the family to, know what happened to their loved ones. It's not good. Whatever the answers are, they're not going to bring their loved ones back. But the not knowing has to be tough.
Absolutely.
And it has to wear you down.
I would say yes.
All right, Gibbs, let's play some of our voicemails before we sign off.
Hey, guys, this is Court from New Orleans, calling in to tell you guys that I love the show, and I have a suggestion for a future episode. I think a great topic would be Ricardo Lopez, also known as the Bjork Stalker. There is plenty, if not days, worth of video and audio that this man recorded during his downward spiral and that led up to his eventual attempted acid bombing of Bjork and his suicide. I think it would make a great episode. Anyway, keep up the great work, guys. Take it easy. Bye.
All right. Great voicemail from Court. That is a fascinating case, the Ricardo Lopez case.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
I just like his name, Court, man. That's a cool name.
Yeah, it is a cool name, Court.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. Hi, Gibby. This is Andrea calling you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. Love the show. Love the Unsolved spinoff show. Humble request. I'm really interested to hear your take on a local crime here, murder of Tim McLean at the hands of Vincent Lee in 2008. It's a really terrible story. It's very disturbing. And I think it ranks with some of the worst stories you've told on True Crime All the Time. Thanks for a great podcast. Keep up the amazing work and keep your own time ticking.
You got to like to hear Keep Your Own Time Ticking, Gibbs.
Getting a lot of good suggestions.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know the story of Vince Lee out of Canada. A horrific story. This guy essentially beheaded a kid on a Greyhound bus. It's brutal.
Yeah.
So she's right about that. It's one of the
sounds nasty.
It's one of the nastier cases that we would cover.
I thought people in Canada were nice.
Well, you could tell how nice she was.
Yeah, she was.
It just came through the recording.
Yeah.
Hi, Mike and Gibby. This is Chelsea calling from Toronto, Canada. And I'm just calling to say how much I love your podcast. I get really excited on Mondays because I have a lot of driving to do. And you guys usually put your new episodes out on Mondays, so it's a great time for me to binge all the episodes. Also just wanted to say that I just think you guys do a great job. I love how you both empathize with all the victims and go into great detail about their life. And, I just really appreciate that. So keep up the good work and have a great day. Bye.
All right. Thanks for the voicemail, Chelsea. And another caller from Canada.
Yeah, Toronto. I've been there. I like that place.
Toronto's Toronto is very nice.
Maple Leafs.
You crack me up, dude. No, we have a lot of listeners in Canada.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. We got to sneak some other Canadian cases in.
Maple Leaf hockey, man.
All right, so we love the voicemails. That's it for another episode of True Crime All the Time Unsolved. So for Mike
and Gibby,
stay safe and keep your own time ticking.